Once Upon a Tide, a Legends of Athea Prequel. Chapter 1. The water swirled across the bay, rocking buoyed fishing vessels gently upon its surface and drawing Belle into a hypnotic dream. Somewhere out there was the horizon hunter, and on it the young cartographer who had lucked his way onto the voyage of a lifetime. To sail east, as far as the myths and legends of old could take them. That had been their mission. Sail until Lanndos was just a distant memory. Sail until the realm of Athea was no more than a fleeting thought on the breeze. Sail until you were sure you would drop off the edge of the map, and then sail some more and you might find land to the east. This was all the guidance anyone planning such a voyage had, because there was no man alive who ever recalled such a journey successfully taking place. There were stories. Of course there were stories. Of a distant land with alien people in possession of a wealth of exotic treasures, foods and creatures, but no man had ever sailed to the east and returned in any lifetime Belle knew of in Athea. So stories were all anyone had. Legends passed down by the sailors and fishermen of Lanndos. Legends which were changed and embellished upon through the years. No one could really be sure what was true over the water, and the last ship which attempted such a crossing returned after 9 months reporting all they encountered was an endless sea. That voyage took place close to 80 years ago, when Belle's grandmother was but a girl. She would recount the story at bedtimes when Belle was a girl herself, tucked up underneath blankets in front of the fire, the lapping of the water against the rocks outside the window, forming the perfect backdrop for such tales. The sailors went in search of bountiful treasures and a new land, but all they encountered were pirates they had to outrun and the majestic beauty of the endless sea. When they returned, they did so without their prize, and each one of those seafaring men vowed never to venture further than Lanndos Bay ever again. All that lives to the east is a watery graveyard impossible to cross. But what of the other stories? Other legends of heroes actually succeeding in crossing the endless sea? What of the tale of Captain Erland Three-Finger Blackwood, the greatest sailor who had ever lived? He and the crew of his ship were said to have made the voyage east, returning with stories of water-dwelling monsters and primitive red-skinned tribes who would eat the flesh of their dead. Delusions of men who spent too long on the water and returned with nothing but stories. Lies to save face, Belle's grandmother would tell her. Belle didn't believe that. Erland Three-Finger Blackwood had been a legend in his own right. His exploits on the seas fighting pirates were heroic and chronicled by the scribes at the Great Hall in Athea. First-hand accounts of Blackwood's adventures were historical fact. Why would his voyage east not be also? Perhaps the most famous scribe to ever live, Walric Ryfin, had accompanied the captain, and his account of their travels was chronicled in the Great Hall of Athea also. It can't have been all but a fantasy. Out there, beyond the horizon, Belle knew in her heart they had done it. Captain Guillan and his crew had succeeded in finding the fabled land. A quick knock on the door followed it being violently thrown open and Red billowing into the room. "Come on, Bee! Father wants us up and ready for the ceremony," Belle's younger sister giggled, jumping onto the bed and then slumping into the goose-down feathered pillows, wriggling around as though she was having some kind of fit. Belle watched and laughed from her mantle at the window. "Red, stop it now. I've just made that bed." Her sister stopped, sitting up and grinning, her fiery red mane wild around her face. "What are you doing staring out to sea yet again? Pining for your betrothed?" "No," Belle said, but before she could protest her innocence any more, her sister burst out laughing. "Oh, my poor big sister, desperate for her man to land back on shore so she can be wed and have lots and lots of seafaring babies." Belle rolled her eyes, moving over to the bed to help her sister up. "James is my best friend, and it has been so since we were children." "Best friend you want to marry and bed, you vixen!" Belle burst out laughing, pushing Red out of her room and closing the door. James Hoke, the son of fishermen Devlin and Marjorie Hoke, had never been keen to join the family business. Not that there was anything wrong with fishing, and then selling one's wares at the market, but from an early age she knew James would go on to achieve greater things. They met the day Belle nearly drowned swimming in Lanndos Bay. She had been paddling in the shallows, and the tide had taken hold of her, pulling her out into deeper waters. Unable to attract the attention of anyone on land, she panicked, thrashing around in the sea until her limbs burned and she tired, sinking through the velvety fingers of the bay towards the seabed. Her memories of their first encounter were jaded, but James told a good story, claiming he noticed her in distress while fishing on the pier and diving in to save her. Belle's father, the Lanndos Keeper, Adam Wickbess, made a huge deal out of James's heroism, and had insisted the Hoke family join them for a feast that night to celebrate it. After that, not only was James allowed at the Lanndos Keeper's mansion unencumbered, to visit Belle whenever he liked, but Belle's father made sure it was the Hoke family's catch which would feed the whole harbour, providing them with the means to expand their operations so they could make the quota. In the 10 years that had passed since that almost fateful day, both the families had thrived together. Wickbess's position as Keeper of Lanndos had been cemented by the King of Athea as the island flourished into a thriving metropolis, and with the ever-increasing population, there was a need for more food. Food the Hoke family provided with their fleet of fishing boats dotted around the island. The Hoek family's son was destined for greater things, though. With their new-found wealth, they sent their son away in his 13th year to study with the master scribes in Athea's capital. There, James learned the sciences, mathematics, studied the Athean bards, and took great interest in the histories and geography of the land. He thrived in his education, returning to Lanndos only when the studies broke at the end of each year. When he returned, he would always call upon Belle, his best friend who had since grown into a woman's body. Each year, the rekindling of their friendship was always stunted at first, but it didn't take long for Belle to recognize her friend whose body was also growing into that of a man's. They would talk, they would laugh, they would swim in the bay together, walk the forest trails up towards Red Hill. Each year everything changed, and then nothing changed. They were still inseparable, just like when they were children. And then, on the 4th visit back to Lanndos, James announced 2 things to Belle. The first being that he had been offered a place on the Horizon Hunter as their cartographer, and that he had accepted this most prestigious and enviable position, and the second being that he loved her, had loved her since the moment he'd plucked her out of the bay all those years ago. Belle thought back to what he said next. Could you ever see yourself settling for a fisherman's son? Why he felt in that moment he had to belittle himself, she never knew, and answered from the heart, Since I was 7 years old, I've never seen myself being able to settle for anyone other than a fisherman's son. They then kissed, a decade's friendship of innocence and laughter turning into something much more. Will you do me the honour of becoming my wife? James had asked her, and she had immediately said yes. But you must ask my father for my hand. James had smiled, nodded, and kissed her again. When I return from our voyage, I will ask your father, and we will be together. James left with the Horizon Hunter a week later, waved off with the rest of the crew as heroes and fools. Land to the east was just a bedtime story. Every child knew that. 17 months had since passed, the longest anyone could recall a ship being at sea. Their provisions would have dwindled months ago. The Horizon Hunter and her crew were now thought of to have perished along their journey, searching for the stories of old. Another knock on the door, and Belle sighed, turning from the horizon which kept her love from her. The door opened, and 2 dressing girls followed in flow, her and Red's waiting maid. Come now, Belle, you must get dressed. It isn't every day a young lady gets to choose her suitor. Ah, yes, that. the reason for the hustle and bustle through the corridors beyond Belle's room, the reason crowds were now gathering in the courtyard below, and she could hear builders putting together the stage on which she would shortly stand in front of everyone. The reason Flo was thrashing around in the wardrobe trying to find a certain dress. Suitor's Day. It was a long Athean tradition that, upon their 17th birthday, young ladies of noble birth would parade themselves in front of lords and knights, in the hope they might be picked to wed the next generation's up-and-coming lord or nobleman. These unions strengthened families and created natural allies, while also, in time, producing the next generation of great families. Belle was no mainlander, though. In fact, she had never left Llandos and ventured west to Athea, nor did she care to. She was an islander, born and raised, and these traditions didn't usually make it to their shores. I think the yellow dress which used to be your mother's. We want you to look your best for the suitors. Her father, despite his many years as Lanndos Keeper, was Athean, and because of his position of power was expected to take part in the fanfare of suiting his children with another family of power. Especially now, Belle knew, with the king not long to live, and no successor named, strength meant everything. "I will not do it," Belle had protested when her father had first ventured the idea of her being suited. "You married Mother for love. You have always taught us that love was the most important thing." "The king demands the union," her father had replied, wafting the parchment on which the decree had been inked in front of his eldest daughter's face. "I will not be paraded in front of the masses in the hope to win the eye of some idiot whose father owns a castle in some far-off land. I won't do it." For months, Belle outright refused to even talk about the suiting, and little had she known her words had not gone unheard. A month ago, Adam Wickbess sat Belle down and produced a new message from the king, reading it out to the squirming delight of his advisers, Cronswich and Lumire. "After some consideration, I believe you correct in your assessment, Lord Wickbess, and although it highly irregular within our traditions, I agree your daughter might be suited to a family of her choosing. Set a date for Lady Wickbess's suiting day. Unfortunately, due to my ill health, I will be unable to attend myself, but I will send emissaries in my place. No doubt there will be uproar amongst the lords whom are invited as potential suitors, and this lightens my heart some. The world is changing, Adam. Let us be remembered as men who embraced that change." "But what does this mean?" Belle had asked her father. "It means, my dear, that this old fool who raised his two daughters single-handedly for the past decade and a half believes you are worth more than being just another pretty face for a spoilt mainlander to maybe pick to wed. They will be at the mercy of your eye." Belle shook her head. Her mother's lemon ball gown, which dominated the painting in the gallery of her and father dancing, was not what she would choose for today's forced celebrations. That dress was so iconic. It depicted the look of adoration her father gave her mother as they twirled around the ballroom. A look of love, a fairy tale romance which was cut short. A tale as old as... "What about the green one?" Belle suggested. Flo paused, nodding her head, and Belle giggled. She knew the maid thought the green dress made her look like a whore, with its dishevelled threaded hem cut high on the upper leg, and low neckline revealing far too much cleavage. It was not in keeping with what the eldest daughter of the Lanndos Keeper should be wearing. This was partly the reason Belle liked to wear the dress in the first place. She wasn't interested in what was expected of her, and she wasn't interested in the suitors her father had lined up either. She had James, and he would return to her. She just knew it. Belle allowed the dressing girls to do their job, bathing and clothing her as though she were one of the dolls she'd play with as a child. Flo was the one who fixed her hair, all the while tutting at Belle's choice of attire. What sort of man would ever want his wife dressed in such scantly threads? "You leave nothing to the imagination, young lady," she mumbled, trying in vain to pull Belle's dress further down towards her knees, and tutting some more when the garment would not yield. All the trouble Master Wickbess has gone to in securing these young men as potential suitors. He's not going to be happy." Belle ignored her grumblings. Her father knew only too well her position on being paraded around like a prized mare at auction, even if technically she was the one doing the choosing. And he also knew there was only one suitor in Belle's eyes, the fisherman's boy. "Well, I suppose this is the best we can do with what you've chosen. Belle, at least, please wear a throw across your shoulders. Your cleavage looks as though it might just pop right out if you were to make any sudden movements." Belle smirked, shaking her head. James loved her in green. He said it brought out her eyes. "He's going to go mad," she heard Red cry out in laughter, returning to the room wearing a dress not all too dissimilar to the cut of her own. "Really? You're one to talk." "But that's just it. I'm expected to play up. The second daughter of the Lanndos Keeper, what else is there for me to do? You, on the other hand, sweet, virgin Belle, whose beauty is unmatched. Finding a suitor for you is a calendar event and a political move for father." Belle held up her hand to stop her younger sister. "No. Don't start that again. I know you enjoy teasing me about it, but I can't believe father would swap me for a strong alliance with another family. The king forced his hand. This is not his choosing. He was joined with mother because they fell in love. He'd want nothing less for his own daughters." Red shook her head. "Oh, Belle, take a look around you. The king of Athea is on his deathbed. The princes are readying up for succession despite their father's reluctance to name an heir, wanting to instead put the leadership of Athea into the hands of her people. Every knight in the land is scrambling about for support, hoping to have a shot at the throne. Lanndos is the biggest of Athea's stepping-stone islands, with its barrier against the mainland to the west and the endless sea to the east. It would be one of the key nations if there were ever an uprising. Father knows this, the princes know this, but you don't want to see that the only way for father to solidify his position as Lanndos Keeper is to have allies. The king may have asked that father keep to Athean tradition, but he hasn't fought the request." "Request?" Belle scoffed. "Since when was anything carrying the royal seal ever a request? A kindly worded demand, more like." "All right. Demand. But still, when did father ever do anything he wasn't firmly behind, royal decree or not?" Red did have a point. One Belle didn't care to think about too much. "And by marrying me off to the son of some Athean lord, you think father would remain as Lanndos Keeper if the princes started a war against each other for their father's throne?" "When, Belle? When the princes start a war." "Do you really think he would forfeit my happiness for an ally?" Red scoffed. "You think he wouldn't?" Belle shook her head. She simply couldn't believe that of a father who had always been so present and close with his girls. Since their mother's passing, it had only ever been the three of them, and it was he who instilled that sense of love before anything else. How could he not, given the circumstances surrounding how he and their mother had met and fallen for each other? Below them in the courtyard, a trumpet sounded, and Belle rolled her eyes at the pomposity of the ceremony which was about to unveil. Red grinned. "It's time. Come on, let's see what fuckwit's father has deemed suitable matches for his little princess." Chapter 2. Belle linked arms with her sister as they followed the dressing girls out of the room and down the hall. Guards lined the corridor on both sides, more for show on this celebrated occasion than to actively guard anyone. Today was a spectacle for the masses, and the people of Lanndos would come out in droves. Their Belle, the girl who had grown up into the most sought-after women on the island, and now it seemed the whole of Athea would find her suitor. It was an occasion not to be missed. Flo stopped 3 paces in front of them as they approached the top of the grand staircase and turned, holding up a hand. "Now remember, ladies, as we practiced, 1 step, smile, another step, gasp at the crowds, another step, wave. Both Belle and Red nodded. They had been practicing their entrance down to the courtyard for a week in anticipation of this morning. Another blast of the trumpet, and from below someone announced above the chatter, "Ladies Belle and Red Wickbess." The girls moved forward as one, and Red whispered to Belle, "Game face now, Belle. Your happy ever after will be down there." Belle nipped Red's arm in response as they set off. Soft music started up as they approached the top of the stairs, and they paused so everyone could get a good look at the most eligible women in Lanndos. In the hall below, around 300 people stared up at them, with more leading out into the courtyard. "Game face," Belle said, and they both smiled, making their way down the stairs with gasps and waves, nods and little hiccups of nervous laughter. At the bottom of the stairs they were met by Lumaya, one of their father's oldest friends, and his right-hand man. He smiled at them both and said, "Exquisite, the both of you. Remember, girls, don't stray from the rose petals. They've been laid down for a reason. Straight out into the courtyard, and Kronswich is waiting." He leaned in and nodded to them both, and then stepped aside so they might continue their journey out into the sun. As instructed, both Belle and Red stayed within the confines of the rose petals, which led the way through the throngs of well-wishers and out into the courtyard. Smiling, waving, being the spectacle the islanders came out to see, the girls reached the raised podium and turned, facing the crowds and taking their spots a step down from the centre stage, awaiting their father's entrance. Another trumpet blasted, and Kronswich took to the stage, quieting down the crowds. "We are gathered here on this most celebrated occasion to witness the suiting of Belle Wickbess of Lanndos," he called out. Boos and cheers flooded through the crowd in equal measure. Those cheering were doing so for the day, the spectacle, the extravagance of being guest at the Lanndos Keeper's manor. Those who booed were shunning a tradition which belonged on the mainland and not on the island. Kronswich calmed the spectators and smiled, unravelling a cylinder of parchment. "May I introduce the first potential suitor?" Belle allowed her mind to wander as 5 young men wearing assortments of armour, silks, and evening dress made their way out towards the stage one by one. Each young man followed by their own entourage of bodyguards and their parents, the real lord and ladies of their homesteads, the puppet masters behind their polished offerings. The suitors. Athea's most eligible bachelors who had travelled far and wide, hoping to win the heart of Belle, and, more importantly to their lord fathers, favour and alliance with Wickbess and Lanndos. After welcoming their guests, there was another blast from a horn, and Kronswich announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, the mighty Lanndos Keeper Wickbess." In a flurry of turned heads, the girl's father entered. A bear of a man standing a head above everyone else, with long chestnut shoulder-length mane and the battle-hardened scar from his temple to the bottom of his jawline, he was unmistakable in appearance. The island's warden, keeper of the peace, and the highest authority shore to shore. Belle watched him approach, his purposeful stride revealing the slight stiffness in his left leg. Yet another wound he had received fighting for those he loved. His steely gaze softened as his eyes rested upon his girls. Taking first Red's hand and kissing it, and then Belle's, he turned to the audience and stepped up onto the stage as Kronswich faded into the background. "Lanndos," Wickbess said, and then stopped, smiling, looking about the people he was charged with protecting. He paced the stage, to the right, turning, and then back to the centre. "My people, my brothers and sisters of islanders." A rush of whoops and applause followed, and Wickbess held up his hand to quieten them. "No, I don't say that for a reaction. For 3 decades it has been my pleasure to serve you, fight for you, keep you. A pleasure." He shook his head and smiled. "We've had some trials, that is for certain. Being the easternmost point before the endless sea, Athea often forgets us, forgets what magnificent achievements we have accomplished. The finest navy in the whole of Athea. We build ships so formidable. Even the pirates who sail the seas think twice when they see our flag." He stopped to allow the cheering to subside. "Our Red Hill forest quail is considered a favourite of the king. Indeed, the last time His Highness visited us, he lay down a protection order on Red Hill so that he could continue to enjoy that particular delicacy for all of time. A meal our hill tribes simply call food is considered divine by our king. We enjoy a peaceful existence on this island. Over the years, people have come to try to take over. They have sailed across from Athea, believing a coup would be met with little resistance. But each time they came, it was you who fought them back. This is your home, and no one walks into your house and demands obedience." "We stand together and fall together," someone shouted out from the crowd. "That's right," Wick-Bess countered, pointing out towards where the voice had come from, and then back at the crest above the Lanndos Keeper's mansion doors across the courtyard. "We stand together and fall together," the very words etched into stone right there. As islanders, you have a shared affinity with each other that mainland Athenians can't understand. I do. I first came here 30 years ago as part of the king's peacekeeping force. Pirates had been attacking this island for far too long. 30 years. Where has that time gone? Wick-Bess smiled. When we took back the capital from the seafaring scum, it became apparent that the former Lanndos mayor had played a part in organizing the coup. A coward, afraid to fight, he folded under minimal pressure through promises of riches, attempting to sell this great island's very way of life. Foghorn, like boos of distaste, hit the stage from the crowds. Many remembered the previous mayor and the attack from the pirates. It had been the first time any force had made it to the capital and installed themselves as authority. Their seat didn't last for long. I stood and fought alongside both you and my men. I was not a soldier, but the king asked me to pick a platoon of warriors who would fight and die, not for orders given by a lofty general, but for a people who were being persecuted by a savage and uncompromising foe. He looked out over the crowds and nodded to a few familiar faces. Athenians who had joined him to fight, and like him, had never returned to the mainland after the fighting. "The tide is turning, ladies and gentlemen. 70 of peace, and now with the king on his last legs, uncertainty looms. We have always had the protection of Athea, yet always been allowed to stay out of the mainland's politics. When the king offered me the position of Lanndos Keeper all those years ago, I agreed on the pledge that our way of life would not be burdened with Athea's customs. We are a nation of islanders, and islanders we shall remain." "Lanndos forever!" someone else shouted out. "Lanndos forever, indeed," Wick-Bess agreed. "But in these trying times it has become apparent that our island could become under threat when the king passes. News from Athea tells us he has only days left and refuses to name an heir, instead wanting to hand the nation to the people. A noble act for sure, but one which will be met with resistance. There will be a civil war. Of that I am certain. This is why I had allowed myself to be persuaded to partake in an Athean tradition I have never believed in, but one which would help protect this island, protect all of us." Belle closed her eyes and waited for the words. "We are gathered here today to witness my eldest daughter, Belle, find herself a suitor." She felt the applause of the crowds, and her heart plummeted to the bottom of her stomach. "The most noble of men have travelled far and wide to be considered. Now this is unusual in itself, that the young lady might do the choosing. But this particular young lady happens to be my daughter." She felt her mouth tighten. Game face. She needed to keep her game face. Opening her eyes, she smiled, and turned her head so that her eyes locked with her father's. She hoped the mask would not betray her, but equally that he would see the heartbreak she was feeling. She didn't care for any of these young men. Belle, join me, her father said, extending a hand towards her as Red squeezed her arm in reassurance. Wick Bess wrapped an arm around her waist and kissed her cheek, whispering, "It'll be all right," before turning back to the crowds and line of suitors who imagined themselves enough for Belle. As you all know too well, I was once a mainlander, a lord with lands and a title passed down to me from my father. He met my mother for the first time on his own day similar to this, where the daughters of possible allies stood before him to be considered. Marriage has long been a political move to strengthen a family's hold on the land or riches they have. When did it stop becoming about love? The crowds murmured, real folk who didn't have much to begin with. So marriage was for love and not strength. They found their strength in the arms of their life partner, not in what a family might offer them for an alliance. Because of the present political climate on the mainland, I decided pairing Belle with an Athean lord would help our position when the inevitable came. As I look out at the assortment of men eager for my daughter's hand, I must thank every one of you for your journey here. Her father paused, turning so that his eyes met with Belle's, and he smiled again. Things are going to get messy, he told her under his breath. What do you mean, why? Turning back to the suitors stood in their finest dress, he nodded at each one. But I'm afraid your journey was wasted. There will be no pairing today. I'm an islander, and the islander way is to marry for love, not position or wealth, alliance nor contract. I trust you will accept my decision, and— Hold on a moment! A cry of outrage sounded from the crowds. Wickbess stopped, scanning his audience as Lord Malliot from the Rush Mountains to the north of Athea stepped forward. This is outrageous behaviour. We didn't come all this way to be told to leave. Wickbess nodded, bowing his head. Lord Malliot, I understand your frustrations, and please accept my most heartfelt apology. Tonight's feast will still continue. The journey needn't have been a wasted one. Feast? You expect putting on an assortment of substandard island gruel enough to simmer discontent? We didn't travel 1,000 miles to the coast, and then a further 1,000 to this island for a feast. I understand you're upset, that all of our guests will feel upset. Upset? Malliot growled, baring his teeth and nodding towards his son. Jensen has been preparing for this day ever since that blasted king decided his passing would leave war in its wake. Wickbess frowned. Be careful, my lord. You do yourself disservice to insult our king. Fuck him. A sudden silence ran through the crowd from Malliot's words. And fuck you, Wickbess. Belle looked up at her father, the smile frozen on his face, and watched his jaw pop. Last chance to quiet yourself, Malliot, or I promise you, your son's succession will come a lot quicker than you have planned. The Lord of Athea's Rush Mountains spat out at the stage. Words. Adem Wickbess, the Lanndos Keeper and Keeper of Hot Air. Belle shook her head, locking eyes with her sister. You didn't speak to father like that, and expect to survive the exchange. She reached out for his arm, hoping her touch would subdue him. He turned to her, his eyes wide, lungs heaving. If he reacted, it would start a war. If he did nothing, he would lose the faith of Lanndos, his people. Malliot began to laugh. Well, the Keeper of Hot Air, have you nothing to say? Around the Lord, his own guards fidgeted nervously, awaiting a brutal response. But this didn't seem to bother Malliot. Lord Malliot, you realize your words cement your doom, her father said, his fists tightening into balls of fury. Belle watched in disbelief, and then caught Red moving off into the crowds, her burgundy dress and fire-licked hair disappearing in the throng. Father, she whispered, squeezing his arm to try and get his attention. She watched as her sister popped up behind Lord Malliot's guards, and then disappeared again. No, Red, she screamed out in her mind. We came here in good faith. And you—" Malliot spat out again, and as the crowds reeled, a knife appeared at the lord's throat, slicing through his windpipe in one silent movement. Cries echoed around the courtyard, and Belle watched in horror as the lord reached up for his neck, blood cascading through his fingers and down his front. Noiseless gasps deafened the crowd, and as he fell to his knees, trying in vain to welcome air into his lungs, Red was stood there, right behind him, the bloody knife in her hand. More screams, and as the Rush Mountain guards turned to Red, Wickbess hollered above the commotion, "Do not dare touch my daughter!" "Daddy!" Red cried out, swiping her knife at a Rush Mountain guard who moved a little too close. Silence, as the Lanndos Keeper jumped down from the stage, leaving Belle alone upon the mantel in front of the whole town. "Move away!" Wickbess screamed out, and from nowhere 10 armoured Lanndos guards appeared at his back. "If you value your lives, men," he said to the 5 Rush Mountain guards surrounding Red, "you will lay down your swords and spears this instant." For a moment, the men faltered. Their master had just been slain in front of them. They were oath-bound to protect their lord. "What of us?" one of the guards cried out desperately. The crowds parted as Wickbess moved closer. "I cannot answer that. Ask your new lord," he said, turning to the cowering son of the late Lord Malliot. Belle's father held out a hand for the young man who had travelled all this way for a chance to win a fair maiden's heart. "Come on, son. You have nothing to fear from me. Tell your men to stand down." The man looked up at Wickbess. "My men?" Wickbess nodded. "You are now Lord of the Rush Mountains." "But my father—" "Your father should have known better, should have shown a little respect when a guest in someone else's home." The young lord took the offered hand and stood up, telling his men to stand down. Wickbess then pulled the man close and said, "Do you accept that had your father not fallen from my daughter's hand, then it would have been mine? That his insults could not go unaccounted for?" Lord Malliot nodded, trembling. "He was a fool. Neither you nor your daughter need worry of a comeback on this. His body grows cold of his own doing." Wickbess smiled. "Excellent," slapping the bewildered lord on the shoulder. "Then perhaps all is not lost, and we might form new alliances despite today not going how you might have first envisioned." "With respect, sir. I'd prefer to take my father's body and leave for home." Wickbess nodded, and Red ran to him as the Rush Mountain guards dispersed. "I'm sorry, Daddy, but if I didn't do something, then you would have had to," she said. Belle watched her father and sister's embrace, stood alone still on the stage. But now all eyes were in the crowd. There would be repercussions, not just for her father, but for Red too. A slain lord is not something which would be easily forgotten by their people. Once safely back home, the Rush Mountain guards and new lord would want revenge before long. Chapter 3. Belle stood at her window, looking out to sea, the endless sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon was Sanity, a boy who loved a girl who was waiting for his return. She squinted her eyes, imagining a speck in the distance, her man coming home to her. She imagined him stood at the helm of the ship, searching his own horizon for her, squinting, as she was, for any inkling of land. Below in the courtyard, men dismantled the stage on which she had stood alone, witness to the carnage that had almost taken place. The late Lord Malliot's son, the new lord, had been scared, cowering like a frightened child with her father looming over him. Of course he had agreed that nothing would come of his father's execution by Red's hand, that the fool had it coming. He wanted to live. He wanted to leave Lanndos as quickly as possible, unharmed. She watched as her father escorted the new lord and his guards down to the harbour. They walked slowly, followed by a dozen of her father's own men. She could hear him laughing, slapping the new Lord Malliot on the back as if they were old friends sharing a joke before saying farewell for now. That was her father's way. Always the diplomat. Always trying to put people at ease. Until, of course, diplomacy was lost. Then the beast would surface, the warrior who knew no bounds. Her and Red had been escorted back to their rooms by Lumaya and Cronswich, and ordered to stay there until their father returned from seeing the Rush Mountain lot off at the harbour. Belle jumped down from the window, marching across to the door and throwing it open. "I'm going to Red's room," she announced to the 2 sentries stationed in the hall outside her room. "Miss, your father—" "My father is walking down to the harbour, and I wish to speak to my sister," Belle said, moving past the guards and down the corridor. When she arrived at Red's bedroom door, she barged past her sister's own guards and into the room. Red was sat upon her bed, staring into space with tears streaming down her cheeks. As Belle entered, she turned. "Belle, what did I do? I put everyone at risk." Belle went to her little sister, wrapping her arms around her trembling frame and kissing the top of her head. "Nothing will happen. Father will make sure of it." Red lifted her hands, stained maroon with blood. "I can't get it off. His blood, Belle. It won't wash off. What will happen to me? I was a fool. Jensen Malliot will come back with the whole of the Rush Mountains force and see me at the end of a rope." Belle led her sister across to the window so she might get some air, sitting her down on the mantel and then joining her. "Look over there, Red," Belle said, pointing out across the harbour. "Do you see Father waving off the Malliot ship?" Red nodded. "And you saw how Jensen Malliot cowered in the courtyard when his father fell? He's scared. He's not coming back." Red shook her head. "You don't know, Belle. Yes, he might be craven, but his father was a valued member of the King's court. He was protected by Athea, by the King. The Rush Mountain Council will demand action against their slain leader." Belle didn't have any words. Of course she knew all of this. The Rush Mountains were a formidable northern Athean realm, and Lord Malliot had always been a brutally loved and respected keeper of those mountains, to be murdered by the daughter of another keeper, and while as a guest. It mattered not any more the words which had been spoken between their father and the late Lord Malliot, that was now irrelevant and open to interpretation. All that would matter is that their keeper was dead at the hands of an islander, and there must be justice. As they watched the Malliot ship disappear around the bay and out of sight, heading north and then west back to their home, Belle sighed, running her fingers through her sister's hair as she sobbed at her shoulder. She didn't know what would happen now, but she knew her father and Lanndos would protect Red no matter what. As her father stood on the pier edge talking to a few members of the Lanndos Island Council, there to see off the new lord, Belle found her gaze drifting back to the horizon. The midday sun beamed down on the water, turning it majestic silver as far as the eye could see. She watched 2 gulls twist through the air together, dancing in the breeze, and floating down to try their luck for small fish, feeding near the water's surface. And then she saw it, a flicker of something in the distance. Was it her imagination, a mirage, the reflection of the sun playing tricks on her eyes? "No," she gasped, squeezing Red's arms and whispering, "Can you see that?" Red moved back from their embrace, looking up at her big sister. "What? What is it?" "Out there on the horizon, I thought. No, there it is again. It's a ship." Belle turned Red's head towards the window, out at the endless sea. "Tell me you can see it?" She stood up, leaning further out towards the ocean. "Belle, I don't know what you—" She stopped, her eyes catching something. "Tell me I'm not imagining this. That is a ship." "That is a ship," Red repeated, and the moment her words ended, the harbour bell sounded. That wasn't any ship. There were none others which had any business so far out east. That was the Horizon Hunter. After 17 months at sea, the presumed lost vessel was home, and with it, Belle hoped above all else, her love, James Hook, the beginning of the legends of Athea.